There, welcome everyone. I am so pleased to see you guys joining us. I know there's sometimes, even as late as we are into the pandemic, it always feels like there's some fun new technical trick to learn. So I'm really glad to know that all of you have been able to navigate that and are joining us. Hopefully you're in the right place. Organizations, sort of business impact behavior, that's the category we're in. We know we're up some tough competition, but we've got some great content for you today. For the icebreaker, while we're getting a few people still, a little bit of a grace period, we do have a tight ship to run. But I'd love to hear in the chat, what are you grateful for? This is one of my favorite questions. Hopefully we never run out of good answers. But think about that for a little bit and maybe we can look at the chat. There's one speaker I'm still trying to connect with. I want to make sure that he can come in before it's too late, a little time zone mix up. So if you want, you can also come off mute for a couple minutes if you want and share something you're grateful for. We can be friends here, even as we're little heads in boxes. We're going to start in about 2 minutes from now. Will, wonderful.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning.
I've been on a couple of global calls recently, and it's good morning, good day, good afternoon, welcome all, wherever people might be coming from. Great. So Nick H, if you don't mind, maybe you already have, but making Will a co-host so he can share his screen. The warm up for if anyone's just getting here, we're asking to break the ice and to introduce you to the chat feature, which sometimes can be a little tricky to remember is there. This is where during a talk, you can put some questions into the chat for the speaker. There will be a couple of minutes after each speaker where some of those questions can be addressed, but most of the conversation is likely to happen. Looks like Will can screen share, which is great. But most of the discussion we have to, for time reasons, put into breakout rooms afterwards, at least 15 minutes up to 25 at the end. And the chat can be a good way to give the speaker an idea of what you'd like to talk about. So don't be shy during the talk. Chrissi Antonopoulos is going to give us a wonderful opening to this session. And Chrissi, I bet you can probably start screen sharing now. And Chrissi works at the Pacific National, PNNL, what does that stand for?
Pacific Northwest National.
Pacific Northwest National Labs. In their research dissemination portfolio, she leads that, and that includes the development and maintenance of Building America's Solutions Center. She supports projects that focus on thermal enclosures, indoor air quality, assessment of socio-demographics, and equity. Chrissi's published studies outlining opportunities for embodied carbon and circular economy perspectives related to building technologies. As well, she's looked at the socio-demographic analysis of energy use in residential buildings. She's got a BS in business economics, an MS in urban studies, and is currently a PhD candidate in urban studies. I think without further ado, let's get going. And I think that's a great way to start.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here and excited to share a really great new project that the Pacific Northwest National Lab is leading for the United States Department of Energy. So my talk today is called Decarbonizing the Building Sector, a human-studied focus on small and light commercial building energy equity. So let's get started here. There we go. So first things first, let's add some definitions. And I think the first thing that we want to talk about is what is decarbonization and what is the role of buildings in a decarbonized economy. This study looks specifically at a very understudied sector of buildings, which are small commercial buildings. So in short, buildings account for 40% of primary energy consumption in the United States. That combines and leads to about 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Decarbonization fundamentally is the movement away from fossil fuel consumption throughout our economic system. In buildings, that means moving away from fossil fuels as a primary energy source. And so when we talk about decarbonization in buildings, we talk a lot about electrification, moving away from gas to a clean energy grid, assuming that we're getting our supply side from clean energy, and then moving into more of an electric consumption in buildings. So kind of have a breakdown here of what that means in a building. Thank you to RMI for developing this awesome infographic that I'm using here today. So we really talk about energy efficiency as being a core piece of electrification. So making buildings efficient so they consume less energy, full stop, regardless of where that energy comes from. Electrification of primarily HVAC equipment, so moving away from a natural gas or combustion furnace into a heat pump and heat pump water heater, and then having smart controls throughout a building so the building can communicate with the electricity grid, so it can adjust maybe end uses at different times depending on when electricity can be the cleanest. Overlaying this big move towards decarbonization sits a focus on equity and justice. There has been a lot of legacy research now, particularly in the residential sector, looking at aspects of equity and justice in the energy system. We know, for example, that low-income, vulnerable, and communities of color have higher energy burdens compared to more affluent populations. An energy burden means that the cost to a low-income household to operate the same equipment in the same profile is more than in a higher income household or a higher income building. Systemic racism and historic exclusionary policies throughout the United States have resulted in increased exposure risk. That's climatic, environmental, economic, and social to low-income and communities of color. Underserved communities often don't have financial resources to purchase, own, and operate high-efficient technologies. And some research is showing that they also do not have access to high-efficiency or advanced building technologies. And so as we move towards this focus on decarbonization, we have a duty to do so with equity and justice at the forefront of all policies moving forward. You know, we are talking about a huge shift in transition of an energy system. And I think, you know, we need to make up for the lack of focus in equity and justice in the past and make equity and justice a central point to energy transitions in the future. The US Department of Energy is funding this specific project I'm going to talk about today. Research to characterize and develop solutions for challenges related to energy and justice that complicate the ability of communities to contribute to their own goals for decarbonization, and then the other goals at more of a societal level. As I mentioned before, small commercial buildings, so we're talking about buildings less than 25,000 square feet. These are community centers, churches, maybe small strip malls, maybe mixed use commercial spaces that might have shops or small grocery stores, mini marts. These buildings all fall into this category. And we're looking specifically across traditionally underserved communities. We want this research to design and recommend strategies that the United States Department of Energy can use to strengthen justice and equity in this building sector and help underserved communities reach goals for a decarbonized economy, and do so in a way that benefits communities as well. So this is by design a human-centered approach. What do we mean when we talk about human-centered research? We're focused on the occupant of the buildings. This is a ground-up approach that aims to talk to owners, operators, small business owners, lessees, folks embedded in the community about what their perceived needs are. So we are doing interviews, survey mechanisms, and outreach into individual communities. So this is a mixed methods approach that uses both qualitative and quantitative approaches and tools for assessing and analyzing the data that we get out of this project. The project is led by the Pacific Northwest National Lab. We are essentially the funnel for the US DOE funding. We have two partners currently. We're partnered with Arizona State University, who's going to be heading the field study protocol and also going to be conducting the field research in the Phoenix metropolitan area, Phoenix Tempe. We're also partnered with Clark Atlanta University, who's going to lead a field study in the interurban Atlanta community as well. And hopefully we're bringing on a third site with a tribal government yet to be determined. So we have two primary areas that we're focused on right now. In Phoenix and Tempe, where the goal is to oversample with Hispanic and Latino-owned businesses. And in urban Atlanta, the goal is to work with and oversample with African-American and Black-owned businesses. And again, really understand from the ground up the perspectives towards decarbonization and decarbonizing goals. As I mentioned, we are looking to expand this study to a third site, and ultimately, we would like to develop a framework that is replicable, so this study can go anywhere throughout the United States. We have two primary tasks that we're going to be focused on here. The first is going out into the study area communities and conducting semi-structured interviews with 200 small business owners. And these are building owners, building occupants, people that lease space, people that rent space. We're really trying to get the gamut of occupants in small commercial. And we're really trying to understand what the knowledge base is about energy efficiency, the role of businesses towards a decarbonized future. What are the energy profiles of buildings, and do the energy profiles of these small commercial buildings vary from one community to another? What are the primary barriers as perceived by the occupants of these buildings? And what, if any, actions have already been taken, either at a business owner scale, a community scale, an urban scale, towards decarbonization? From there, we aim to use the information that we gather from the surveys to help or from the interviews to help inform a more broad survey instrument that we plan on distributing to a larger subset of the community. And the survey design is aimed at kind of extrapolating out what we find from these individual interviews into the broader community in general. We really want to use this study to gain a solid understanding about small building commercial use. That is a big missing piece in energy research generally. We would like to understand what the equity and justice issues are in different communities with different racial, economic, and cultural backgrounds. And we'd like to develop an actionable and replicable framework that the United States Department of Energy can use to advance decarbonization goals with equity and justice as a top priority. So that's a kind of high-level summary of our study. We're just kicking off. We aim to start the field portion of the study early spring 2022, and hopefully next year I'll be back with some interesting results to share. Thank you very much.
Chrissi, thank you. Your your management of time was excellent. We do have a couple minutes if anyone has any particular questions that are sort of quick to handle. Please do use the chat. Certainly an area where more research is absolutely warranted. And if it sounds like there's an opportunity it's still live and any influence would be helpful. Are there any questions there that you had a chance to look at, Chrissi, if you want to take a quick look? It looks like Therese asked, but then you answered it. So why don't we put up your poll, if that can work, Nick? And while that's coming up, folks can respond to the question, but I'm going to pivot unless there are any other questions coming in. I'm not seeing any. But up next is our next speaker, Katie Janda, whose name I will never forget again because it's like panda with a J. I think, Katie, I was going to give you an intro, but did I correctly understand that today is a special day for you?
Yes, it's my birthday.
All right. So
you guys can sing to me afterwards, after I finish my my presentation. How's that?
I think that would be a stellar thing to accomplish. But welcome, Katie. Thank you for sharing some of your day with us. I hope you've had a good day so far. Hopefully it's just going to get better from here on out. I'll give you a little background and then I'm going to hand the stick over to you to carry forward. Katie has a long and storied career. She studies innovations at the intersection of people, energy, and buildings since 1990 at Berkeley, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, part of EPA's Energy Star Buildings program, and Oxford University. She's particularly interested in anything that is not a house. Her work explores the role that building professionals sort of are driving middle out change, implications of ownership in the commercial real estate industry, including green leasing and energy management practices in universities, offices, stores, churches, theaters, and small businesses. Katie, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Nick. Am I off mute and so forth? Can you guys, can you hear me?
You sound great and you look great.
Okay. Great, thank you. All right, so I want to thank Chrissi for starting things off, especially talking about equity, because I'm going to be talking about equity, but in a slightly different way. And the thing that I am really interested in is the fact that buildings are not just owner-occupied. Chrissi mentioned both owners and occupants, but not really the whole gestalt around tenanted properties, which I think is often understudied because we're so busy looking at the building rather than what the decision-making structure is within the building. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And the work that I'm talking about today draws on a lot of stuff, including stuff that I did with the Swedish Energy Agency and one of the IEA DSM tasks that C. Rotman was involved in. And I think she's involved in BECC at this point. So if you see talk to her about green leases, she knows a lot. Am I getting the next slide? There we go. Okay, so what do lawyers have to do with energy efficiency? If we're talking about tenanted properties and including cooperation with lawyers. Well, lawyers have a lot to say if we're looking at tenanted properties versus owner-occupied, depending on where you are in the world. Approximately 50 to 70% of the commercial buildings are tenanted. And so that's a lot of buildings where the ownership model matters. And tenanted properties have leases. Leases set the contractual relationship between the ownership and what I'm calling the usership as a form of interorganizational governance, right? That there's at least two parties involved, which really complicates things. I would also say that lawyers and leases are understudied in the energy field. The leases themselves usually ignore environmental issues, environmental models, meaning sort of building stock models that people at the national labs use, usually ignore leases. And the proposal is that green leases and green leasing can bridge this gap. And I said, this talk is mostly conceptual, but it's based on previous empirical research in several different countries, and there are references on the slides to those studies. So first of all, I just wanted to say the difference between leases versus leasing. So a lease Many of you have probably signed one in a house when, when you rent an apartment or a house or something, or a car, you sign a piece of paper, and that is known as the lease. Maybe people read all the stuff in the lease, maybe they don't. Leasing is a cooperative thing that's based upon the lease. I don't know if you've ever been a landlord, but you really cannot write everything that you want the tenant to know. There's a lot of stuff that goes unsaid, or there's interpretation. So that's why there's sometimes acrimonious things about who said what to whom. But really, the notion is that leasing is largely is a practice. It's unwritten. The lease is something which lawyers can argue over. What are greener leasing practices? Well, traditional leases have some problematic practices. One is that there's split incentives where the landlord invests in the technology and the building, et cetera, and the tenant pays the energy costs, either directly or through a service charge. So there's a gap there. There's an adversarial relationship, often known as utility maximizing, but basically, you have two peanuts pushing the same direction onto a single area, which is that the landlord wants more rent and the tenant wants cheaper rent. So that sets them up as adversaries. But then leases also tend to ignore environmental issues, or if anything, if you write into a lease, basically the tenant is not supposed to change anything that would create damage. So greener leases allow for green improvement clauses, try to provide ways for tenants and landlords to work together. It also tries to work on data sharing and maintaining energy ratings, which we don't have a lot of in the UK, but there's a lot in Europe and in Australia, which I'll talk about in a minute. So some of the work doing on comparison of green leases and leasing in the UK and Australia, I wanted to remind you that leases are a private contract. They're not a policy tool. So it usually goes with voluntary environmental issues rather than regulatory ones. Green leases are not a panacea. They may have more symbolic value than material impact. Because not a lot of people read the leases. So the lease can say whatever it says, but unless someone's being held accountable to the lease, it may not actually matter. There's also light green and dark green lease clauses, which have to do with how mandatory they are. But early adopters of green leases suggest that the negotiation process of the lease itself provides a platform for discussion and cooperation. So that's kind of a nice thing. I promised to talk a little bit about policy and green lease context. I'm sorry, we have a new kitten, so perhaps you hear some some arguments in the background. That's not me, it's the kittens. Anyway, in Sweden, UK, and Australia, all three of these countries have building regulations and energy efficiency targets. There's the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive in Europe, and neighbors in Australia. So there's our rating schemes for the buildings. The green leases may or may not refer to this policy context. So even though it is a private contract, it's happening within a broader context that is recognized. And then in all three countries, there are intermediary groups that support these green leases and toolkits. So they're not coming out of the ether. There's a Swedish Property Federation and the Better Buildings Partnership in the UK and Australia who are all supporting this kind of work. But it's important to say, and this goes back to Chrissi's presentations, that green leases tend to be used mainly by large landlords with prime properties. What does that mean? If you look at tenants and landlords as two different sides of a matrix, where each one can look at business as usual and the capacity to improve, what you have is that if neither the tenant nor the landlord wants to change their business to decarbonize, you're not going to get green leases. On the other hand, if you have both tenants and landlords, both tenants and landlords interested in being green, you'll have what I call green lease nirvana. And I'm not going to go through all the specifics of this. It is in the paper that's noted on the side. But what's interesting, I think, is these other two boxes, the tenant-led green leasing and the landlord-led green leasing, because in each one of those cases, we don't exactly know who's leading what, or how far you can go if one side of the equation wants a green lease and the other one doesn't. I will say that in terms of lawyers and landlords, this is where the activity is. These are sort of the bigger landlords, and there's a lot of opportunity in this area. But I want to focus on the area, the upper left quadrant up here, where it's collective inaction, because it's generally subprime markets and smaller landlords, which is actually sort of the same thing that Chrissi was talking about. So the next slide, I want to talk about why collaboration matters. And here, I've split the building stock basically into the data rich and the data poor. And I think, again, this is a very good way of thinking about what Chrissi was talking about. But I also have it split into, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but owner occupied and leased space. And so this is where most of the activity is happening in green leasing. And this area down here, the data poor, the sort of small, as Chrissi said, the light commercial, is really not very well established. And from a policy perspective, it's easier to work with the data rich, where you imagine that they have all the data, they know what their building stock is, they have resources, they have money, they understand that they have to limit their emissions. And it's the other side of the coin, really the data poor, which is difficult to reach. It's a hard to reach sector. So next steps, I will say that we're doing new research on ownership and usership in the UK. So there's a 3D stock model, which looks at the morphology of the built environment. So it's all of the sticks and bricks. And we want to add another dimension to it, which is really ownership and usership. Who is using these buildings? Who owns them? And what do those portfolios look like? Another idea is that in the private sector, I think there's an interest in standardization across leasing practices. There's no international standard for a green lease, but international property portfolios might be served well by an international standard. And then the public sector could be used as a national policy tool, which is already happening in many countries, but not necessarily with leases. That is happening in Australia, where Australia owns and rents a large number of buildings, and has used that power to try to work on this collaborative element. So with that, I thank you. And birthday singing may commence when next you feel it's possible.
I love that. Thank you, Katie. Birthday singing can happen. I guess the first question I have is in the chat, or anyone, any quick questions for Katie? Any particularly good singers that are also particularly brave, or at least embracing life? Want to come off mute? Carl, that's almost a barbershop.
I'm ready to go.
Therese put a hat on.
The lyrics
Thank
were
you, that's very
written
kind.
The lyrics were written by 2 kindergarten teachers in my city, Louisville, Kentucky, so I'll help sing.
All right,
right.
Sarah and Dave, thank you. Why don't you guys lead us off?
I'm kidding. We don't have to sing, but thank you. We can sing in our minds.
We'll go to the breakout room. We'll stay on time, but just a plug for the breakout room. And we're going to try this poll thing again. I think I messed it up last time, so I'm sorry about that, Chrissi. But tech support, are you able to launch that poll, or is it still? Oh, it's still weird.
Still getting that same error message, Nick.
Okay, well, it's still giving me the capability, but hopefully you guys see a poll now.
Yeah.
Okay, so the intent here is we leave that open for a smooth segue. Katie, I'm going to thank you, and we'll, I guess, remove the spotlight off of you and put it onto Will. Will knows what he's talking about because he has a rich career in food service. He is a chef. And Will, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher your intro a little bit, and the puns are just everywhere. I'm so sorry. But you have a fresh perspective on the food service industry. Will, I couldn't hear you if you were talking.
No problem.
Okay. And now I can't find my tab with my notes. Okay, so Will joins us from SoCalGas. He is the food service program advisor for their food service equipment program. And Zoom loves to take over my screen whenever screens get shared. But he's been in the food service industry since 2001. He focuses on promoting the features and benefits of energy efficient natural gas food service equipment through live equipment demonstrations, educational and food safety trainings, and leading and developing and frankly, delivering seminars. He's got 14 years as a food service manager, trainer, and a supervisor in the food management system. I could go on and on because he's got certifications out the wazoo, but I'm going to hand you the stick now, Will. So why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Nick. By the way, happy birthday, Katie. It's an honor to be here to join all of you here today to speak at the BECC. And talked a little bit about what SoCalGas is doing for our commercial food service customers, since that's really the industry that I started my career in a while ago. I just also wanted to thank Dr. Legaspi for her work in leading the project, as there was just a lot of different components in building up to where we are today. So I'm not sure if we heard the polling questions, but one of the polling questions was asked, how much more energy on average does a commercial food service operation use than a commercial building?
So, Will, I can launch that for you now if you want it to run.
Okay.
Does that help? Okay.
Perfect.
It's open now.
The other question was, do you have experience working on supporting commercial food service industry? So I'll give that a quick second. I'll go back to that. But when you look at the commercial industry and the commercial food service industry, very different, definitely much more of a focus sector, as when we're looking at commercial food services, they're utilizing about 5 to 7% more on average energy than your standard commercial building for the food service kitchen space. So many that support the food service industry, like other third parties that we've worked with, have determined that when you're even looking at the residential industry compared to the commercial food service industry, that a standard commercial fryer can often consume as much energy as an entire residential household. The simple answer is that restaurants' energy usage is intensive because, you know, obviously they're feeding more people than just one residential household. You're looking at fast food, you're looking at college, university, correctional facilities, and they're trying to utilize point of sale systems, drive-through systems that are going to push customers through their small location within a quick period of time so that they get more tickets. So under a business model, when you're looking at all these restaurants, the question is, how can utilities support commercial food service industries like your standard, maybe Jack in the Box or McDonald's or other food service operations? How can we support them different than your residential customers? So as we move to the next slide, which I'm in charge of, we're looking at the comparison of your residential commercial food service building. You're looking at the square footage of the restaurant versus the commercial building. And as I talked about a lot of these different points, first, I just wanted to jump into SoCalGas's commitment to our restaurant customers, to the state, to the industry, and achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions in our operations. And we're focused to deliver and save energy by 2045. So we have this unveiled. It's an ambitious goal. And we believe that projects like this will help us make that commitment to our customers and help them save. So as we jump to the next slide, just a little bit of background of the project. We are working with restaurants with savings, and we're estimated to save approximately about 10% of energy per location site. The behavioral-based energy efficiency restaurant test project is focused on energy savings that can result from changes from restaurants' usage. So when you look at behavioral programs, restaurants are definitely something that's hard to tackle. SoCalGas has identified in our studies, looking at our AMI data, high usage participants, potential usage peer comparisons, and restaurant change. For this reason, we have been able to work with third parties to identify customers that that would be a good candidate for energy savings, for behavioral savings, and we've been able to work with others to estimate we could save them hopefully around 10%. So as we're moving forward with the project, we have developed an engaging dashboard that will help motivate the restaurant chains and site chain locations to really do a positive competition amongst their chain with their locations. So SoCalGas will provide the restaurant with combined energy usage of the chain locations individually and collectively, and assess peak usage and more. So this is just a little snapshot when we're looking at a restaurant chain and looking at their average hourly usage. How are they turning on their equipment? Are they turning it on right when they come in? Are they turning it on at the proper time per that restaurant concept and equipment production schedules and operations? So jumping into the gamification component, we are looking at utilizing gamification, as we know has been proven to positively, for the majority of the time, increase influence behavior and promote energy savings. So in summary, we have to win over the corporate team, which we're doing, and then also work with corporate to win over the location sites to motivate them to make these adjustments at their facility. As we know, COVID has been quite a challenge. The pandemic has been quite a challenge. So that has caused some delays, but for the majority of the start of the project, restaurants are coming back. We're seeing positive interest in joining the project, in measuring and comparing the usage at all their facilities, utilizing the algorithms that have been put together to do a fair comparison per site location, to encourage positive performance, to have rewards, to encourage a positive collaboration amongst each chain. So as we jump into the next slide, we're looking to motivate these restaurant chains to offer incentives and offer dollar incentives to the locations based on their reduction in usage per site. So for the chains that are participating within the SoCalGas territory, if they meet certain goals, if they are able to reduce usage, then they can be offered a reward based on the length of time that they have received first or maybe second place for any given time. Something tangible that they can use, hopefully, that can be invested towards energy efficiency, hopefully that can be invested towards building back their teams through COVID. So as I'm jumping into the next slide, I know I'm getting a little bit tight for time, but we want to implement this with each organization, as each restaurant organization and chain is different, to work with corporate, to work with each site GM, with their staff, with their managers, with their chefs, to show them the buy-in of how it could help them improve operations and increase savings. They can bring dollars back in their pockets. So looking at our interactive dashboard, here are some of the resources available that we are engaging with the customer. We're encouraging them to work together, to win together, to take the challenge, to identify savings opportunities that they see and that we see based on the data that we're receiving. So looking at this one random site that I pulled, you could see the energy usage on the weekends, which is in yellow, and midway throughout the day. And based on this type of operation, we can calculate savings through the dashboard and also give them engaging energy savings tips. We have a great frequently asked question section. We have energy savings tips available. And really at the end of the day, and I'm looking forward to discussing more about this in the breakout session. But what our goal is, how we measure success. But in summary, it's if we're able to help our customers save approximately 10% of energy, and really target and pinpoint what those opportunities are, as there's so many different variations and variables that go into each chain and type of food service operation. And that's all I have.
All right. Well, thank you, Will. And reminder, the poll did finish. I want to say that it looks like, I'm not sure who can see what in here, but it looks like a third of you do have experience in the food service sector. And many folks thought that the energy usage of a commercial food service operation compared to a commercial building, half of the respondents thought it was greater than 20%. A quarter thought it was 10 to 20%, and another quarter roughly thought it was between 5 and 10.
Okay. Those are good estimations.
And apparently, Dave Hall helped me out to share the results by pressing that button. So thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
And thank you, Will. I'm going to pivot just for time's benefit to our last speaker, Kate Merson. And I think, Kate, unless I'm wrong, I think I'm running your screen for you. Is that right?
Yeah, if that's okay.
I think it should work fine. Can people tell me when? Okay. How does that look?
Looks great.
Okay. And now my notes for you. Kate's awesome. She's the director of market transformation at her firm, focusing on market transformation, distributed energy resource programs, demand response, energy efficiency, market research, overall a tremendous depth of knowledge and experience, looking broadly at what we're trying to do and how to do it better. Clearly the need is important. I don't need to cover that ground before, but Kate, I did want to give you a warm welcome and thank you for being our anchor leg. And as well, just so that everyone knows, when Kate's done speaking, there might be a couple minutes for Q&A, but then really all of our speakers will be available in their own breakout room for at least 15 minutes. So without further ado, Kate, I'm going to try to do a good job running slides for you. Just let me know when you want them to move.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick, for organizing. And this has been a really fun session for me to listen into up until now. Thanks for the introduction. So I think, when we think about behavior, particularly, I've been going to the BECC conference for many years. It's a wonderful conference. And I think the industry, we always think of end users, driving, very similar to Will's presentation there, where we're providing energy usage feedback, tips, gamification, you name it, to drive some sort of conservation behavior in the end user. And the work that my team does at Resource Innovations, we certainly care about behavior, but we are looking at behavior all along markets, all along the supply chain. Consumers matter, but also all of the upstream actors matter as well. Next slide, Nick. So just very quickly about Resource Innovations, we are a solution provider to utility companies. We work throughout the US and Canada, helping utilities really decarbonize and do it equitably. I really appreciated the first presentation. This is something RI certainly tries to walk the walk on, and I'll even touch on it today when talking about markets. How can market transformation be related to equity? I'll even touch on that a little bit. And just one other kind of news, I guess, PSA, if you haven't heard, Nexent is now a part of Resource Innovations. So we're really proud to have the expanded capabilities and impacts on our team. Next slide, Nick. So I think why, I want to make it compelling to you why I think there's a real need to look at market transformation has to do with this, right? We all know the goals are huge that we're up against. Clean energy policies have taken off at the state and municipal level. Utilities are making commitments to clean energy, and the timelines are narrow, right? There's not a huge margin of error that we can afford. Meanwhile, the way we've done our energy efficiency and DER programs up until now really is very consumer centric. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Resource acquisition rebate models are driving utilities towards kind of, per widget rebates. And this goes after low hanging fruit, which is no longer there. So how are we going to bring some of these underutilized measures, technologies, these new technologies to adoption and do it quickly? Next slide. So in market transformation, we think a lot about product adoption in markets, right? This is not a new slide, you may have seen it. It's called the diffusion of innovation curve. It was developed back in the 60s for any company, anyone thinking about how do you move from low product adoption to accelerate very quickly. And it groups you into 5 different categories. You've got your innovators on the left, and those are kind of the folks that are lining up outside of the Apple store. They're your free riders, if you will. They don't need much nudging to do what you want them to do. The laggards are really your hard to reach. These are often even your LMI customers that are kind of left out. They're not going to adopt until they have no choice. So I've been doing DSM now for over 15 years, doing program design, and there are so many examples of measures where we're still in the innovators and early adopters after decades of doing this work. Next slide. So I kind of put this in here to be a little controversial because I know at BECC we do love to talk about behavior and consumers, and I'm not saying they're not important. In fact, they're extremely important, right? Our success or failure depends on the decision that they ultimately make. So we need to show them value. I guess my argument is we've been very focused on rebates that really only get at the practical value, right? It drives down the incremental cost and motivates consumers towards one product versus another. But you can think of many instances. We've heard about some of these today, the food service industry. Katie, you talked about working with multifamily properties and tenants, right? Markets are really complex. And so I think we need to think about who influences the consumer. Is it a contractor? Is it a property management firm? We need to define who these decision makers are all along the supply chain and think about interventions that are bigger than the end user. Next slide. So in market transformation, we really look holistically. Our end state is not to claim a savings per widget, but to really change the market in an accelerated fashion. So we examine all of the market actors and the role that they play in a market. What are their perceptions? What's their familiarity? Where are the barriers? Or conversely, where are the huge levers that if we were to unlock would have rippling effects on ultimately what is a consumer decision? Next slide. So this is our definition at RI of market transformation. We're really looking to strategically intervene in the market to create a lasting change. That's getting to the other side of the bell curve, right? Where we can remove all the incentives. And this is what we do now. We talked about heat pumps and getting them to maybe be the standard for a code adoption. There's a chat there. And ultimately accelerate adoption. So market transformation emerged back in the 90s. This isn't a new concept. And the reasoning was that many realized in the industry that by targeting more fundamental market barriers, we can actually unlock a force right within the market and do the accelerated adoption of technologies. Next slide. I'll actually skip through this because I know we are time constrained, but I'll just mention very quickly, again, we're looking at changing the market, and the way it's measured is different. We're looking at whole changes from the natural market baseline, which is your product sales or penetration without any intervention. And the top line is what, how we, can envision and forecast acceleration. We do set our utility clients up to actually claim the delta between those. So you're actually going after bigger savings, being rewarded for it, and you're doing more holistic interventions that you are motivated to do. Next slide. Let's bring it down to earth just in the last few minutes through a technology that I'm really excited about. RI does do, my team does turnkey solutions, and I'll just briefly walk you through it. Hopefully get you excited about a new and emerging product that could really solve a lot of our problems with building shell measures. Next slide. So when we look for a market service product that's good for MT, it's not for everything, right? It's your products that have low market penetration, they're stagnant, something's deficient in the market, there's a big market barrier, and usually we can kind of predict what those are. We also like to look for some sort of product advantage. Is it superior to kind of the incumbent technology from a consumer point of view? Next slide. So thin triple windows, I'm very excited about. This is, in most homes, I think we know building shell measures matter a lot, yet they've been kind of left out of energy efficiency programs for a really long time. The reason is that existing products, the high efficiency model, which is called a thin triple, a triple pane window, which is different from thin triple, is really cost prohibitive, right? It's expensive because the product is really heavy. It requires like a whole retrofit of an existing building or residence. So this really narrows your audience, right, for making a window upgrade. And yet you look at kind of, back to equity, this is an important part in thermal protection of a home and in heat loss. And so thin triple windows actually overcome some of these challenges. They're as light as double pane windows. They're easy to install. And in Illinois, we recently worked with utilities to get this into the TRM as a first step in our market transformation initiative. The challenge here, like with many new technologies, huge market barriers, awareness all up and down the supply chain, lack of consumer awareness, and manufacturers are even reluctant to produce that volume because they're not quite sure what is the appetite. So we're looking at all this, and I'll go to the next slide here. First, understanding this market ecosystem is step number one. And so my team does in-depth market research to understand the landscape, the product flow, how sales are made or not made, what drives decisions and behaviors among all of these actors. Next slide. So logic models are basically a program design. It's a roadmap, right? The next step, once you're armed with this really good knowledge about the market, what we do is we define our end state, which for us is we're working at 50% of market share of thin triple windows for Energy Star products. We also want to have the state code in Illinois recognize thin triple windows. And so we work backwards, right? Our end state, we have our strategic interventions on this roadmap that address the key market barriers. And it's very holistic. It includes consumers, but it also includes many of the market barriers that I already mentioned above. Next slide. Evaluation is really critical. And in Illinois, we actually worked with stakeholders to put into the technical reference manual the ability for utilities to claim market effects savings, which unlocks this is a market barrier for us, right? Utilities need to be rewarded to do these big game-changing things. And so we've done this in Illinois. And with thin triple windows, we're continuing to get down into the nitty-gritty to ensure that utilities can reap the savings from these big market interventions. Next slide. Then we pilot and test this out to bring to full scale. And we're going to be doing this as early as next year and over the course of many years to really transform this market. We're working with national home builders and window manufacturers to really examine and test out this hypothesis, enable them to feel comfortable with the installation, with the technology, raise awareness, and also signal to manufacturers that yes, indeed, there is a market here. Next slide. And when you do market transformation and you're looking to change a market, your mind suddenly goes bigger, right? Markets are big, they're global, and it fosters collaboration. So we're working collaboratively with actors in the Pacific Northwest, California, utilities in Illinois, and we have this the Partnership for Advanced Windows Solution, which also helps coordinate this group to signal, right, we represent a big market force. We're going to standardize the work that we're doing. We're going to learn from one another and do these interventions as strategically and coordinated as possible. Next slide. Finally, this is my last slide. Resource acquisition programs, our rebate programs, and the consumer, they all need to go together if we're really going to hit these targets. I'm a firm believer of that. And we like to think of resource acquisition models as really targeting those hard to reach customers. Why are we going after high propensity innovators, right, and early adopters when from an equitable standpoint, these dollars need to flow to those most in need and most maybe that have the biggest market barriers to participate. So we work actively in any market transformation initiative to really understand who those hard to reach customers are through in-depth market research and to put the dollars where they're needed most, including within triple windows. So thank you all. And if you want more information about that PAWS collaborative group or thin triple windows market transformation, I could talk about this stuff all day. But thanks for having me today, Nick.
Thank you, Kate. And I've just launched your poll question. I'm going to stop sharing my I want to thank you for time, for swinging a very strong anchor leg. And did it stop sharing? Yeah, great. So just a reminder, in about 3 minutes, we are going to split into breakout rooms for each topic. I'm going to try to go right up to quarter after the hour so we can look at the poll results. And Kate, I guess I'll just, I don't see another question in the chat, but from a behavioral perspective, you mentioned the role that the TRM treatment, I'm assuming that was for being able to claim that delta between those market transformation curves and the behavior of utilities is something. Are there other sort of behavioral entities that you think of through that behavioral lens that your logic model sort of highlighted?
Oh, yes. Regulators, I think, are really important here and just setting the rules of the road. I kind of touched on a few times that I think are resource acquisition models that utilities are rewarded to do, right? To go after the low-hanging fruit, acquire savings quickly in the short term. It drives their behavior. And so I think regulators play a key role in behaviors of that drive utility programs to be more holistic versus not. I would say they're a big one that we often leave out.
And maybe it's an obvious follow-up, but behavior historically has had challenges of measurement from a savings claiming perspective. That's not what's in the TRM, but in terms of how you measure progress of your change, perhaps again, it's in the logic model, but what do you look most at to try to measure how successful you're being? Is it just the downstream sales or are there other earlier indicators?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is why working with evaluators is so critical. So in Illinois, we did get into the TRM the ability to claim market effect savings. It does look at your baseline sales and the impact of the intervention, but it's many other things too. We do continued market research to see, have we changed the perceptions? Have we changed the stocking behaviors? Have we changed attitudes towards the product? And over time, you do see those. And so it's a theory of change evaluation approach that's a little bit different from kind of a typical program.
Thank you. I'm going to end the poll and then I'm going to share the results. and I'm going to put another plug in. So there will be singing in at least one of the breakout rooms because we have a birthday speaker today, but I also want to sort of be equitable and promote that any one of the breakout rooms can burst into song. That's totally fine. In some ways, you might have more freedom into which song you burst into. But looking at the poll results, I think everyone can see it, but just in case you can't, the question was, to what degree do you work to influence behaviors of non-consumer market actors? Very often is in second place at 28%. Often is in tied for sort of last place with not at all at 17%, but somewhat is the leading answer. So with that, I think I'm going to thank all of our speakers collectively. We will not come back here at the end of the breakout rooms.